try to use your own data if you can to build out a project, because that way you kind of understand that data already and you have a lot of interesting questions that you probably want to understand from that data. Because if you've ever taken a course and you're sharing your project at the end of the course or whatever, and you're just like, okay, this is what I did because I had to do it and here it is, versus hey, I just downloaded my Fitbit information and guess what? In the summertime, I'm actually not as active as I thought I was. Bring in some weather data, you had just rain the entire summer, right? So you didn't get outside, you didn't want to go to the gym, you just stayed inside the whole time. And so you can incorporate those findings when you're sharing as well.
On Reddit, there's a thread called Data's Beautiful.
Yes.
And I've been seeing a lot of these recently where people have their calendar of their drinking days, how much alcohol they consume. And some people do a dry January or something along those lines. And that's an interesting one too, is, I'm tracking all these other metrics. How does something like that fit into these things? You might not want to share that one in an interview, just if you're drinking a lot.
Right. Don't show them your spike in the pandemic.
Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Monica K. Royal. So Monica was an auditor turned data person who hopes to inspire other people who are entering the data field. She started the company Nerd Nourishment with aspirations of it becoming an educational platform for the data community. She's also a podcaster who over the last year has really done a great job of telling stories in the data space. Today, we talked about how she made her transition from auditing to data within the same company she was working on, how she views regulation and continued education within the data space, and then finally, what she's learned from interviewing a lot of data people on the podcast as well. I really enjoyed this conversation with Monica, and I'm sure you will as well. Monica, welcome to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. It's been a long time coming. You obviously have a podcast of your own, and I'd love to be able to compare some notes, learn about your story, and share it with all the listeners here.
Yes, thank you so much, Ken, for having me on the show. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. And so, as I'm sure you know, the way that I love to kick things off is with a little story from your background, your experience. When did you first get interested in data? And was it a slow progression or was it sort of an immediate thing that got you hooked?
Yeah, so I first learned about data after being, I think, 2 or 3 years into my first adult job out of college. So I'm a little bit older. So in college, data science, data analytics wasn't a thing that was officially taught. So I got my degree in accounting and management information systems. And what that transpired into was my first adult job being an IT or security auditor. And that basically meant that I was testing different systems within companies and making sure that they were secure and working appropriately. Lots of looking at configurations of passwords. Some other things that were funner were social engineering attempts. I tried to break into a bank to try to get back and snoop around people's desks to kind of test clean desk policies and stuff. That was really, really fun. But I, being a natural, curious person that I am, wanted to figure out what the other auditors were doing. So there were financial auditors that were doing other work. And so I helped them out, and they tasked me with trying to identify revenue fraud. And so they gave me a data dump of all the revenue within the company. And they said, hey, use Benford's Law to try to identify this revenue fraud. And so it was basically a distribution that shows any random number that happens in the real life shows a specific distribution. So you'll see it leading with 1 first, and then it kind of goes down to 9, that distribution scale. So yeah, long story short, that was my first introduction to data and data analytics. And from there, I basically asked my manager if I could be put on more projects that related to that type of work. And that started my data enthusiasm.
Amazing. And so, what did that evolve into? How did that progress over the course of your career? You obviously get your foot in the auditing world with a data project, data problem. How does that turn into more traditional data work that you were doing?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that we were doing as security auditors was judgmentally sampling things, looking at configurations of systems. So it was very manual work. And after learning about data and these data dumps, I wanted to explore if maybe I can use that in my audit role. And I went on to Coursera, took some courses, and figured out some ways that I could apply it to the work that I was doing. Again, went back to my manager and I was like, hey, check this out. We can actually use data and test like the entire population in one go rather than pick and choose these samples to test. And yeah, so he let me run with that project. And I basically ended up building out I call it like a sister department within that audit department that focused on applying data analytics to the different audit projects.
So it seems like there are some processes that within auditing or within a lot of fields that are a bit antiquated that could be dramatically improved with data. Why does it take individuals that have initiative like you to make those things happen at a micro level within an organization rather than them necessarily happening at a macro level across entire industries?
That's a really good question. So, again, when I first got into the audit world, data analytics, the way that data analytics is talked about now, wasn't really existent in the audit field. And so, audit folks are part of memberships like ISACA. And even within there, a lot of the like education that was shared was only around traditional audit attempts and security and that foundational level. So I think it was just like very, very new.
Are some of those best practices being, I mean, you might not know you haven't been in audit for a while, but are some of those data best practices being shared more broadly these days? How long is the adoption cycle for something like that to take on in more traditional fields?
Yeah. So yes, it is catching on now. That was over 10 years ago. Remember, I am a little bit old. So that was over a decade ago that, data analytics didn't exist in that space. Now, when I go to ISACA conferences, there are different sessions that talk about how to use data analytics within an audit. So it is becoming more of a natural thing to use within audits.
Okay, amazing. Because I'm always interested in the idea of sort of a big boat and a little boat. Is that a big boat, a tanker takes a long time to turn. Even if you see the iceberg, you still have a lot of different people to orchestrate and organize to be able to turn and make changes. Where in the little boat, one person can turn the wheel and change things really quickly, but you don't have the power and the capacity and a lot of the other things that the big boats have. And it's interesting to see that in the scope of more regulated or more traditional industries like accounting, finance, things along those lines, versus newer industries like data science, software engineering, things along those lines. I'm interested in your perspective at the intersection of both of these things. I mean, what has your experience been kind of living between those two worlds?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you talk about regulations and how to, learn those new things. How quickly does it take to adopt those new techniques and whatnot? One thing that I really enjoy just in general is the fact of continuous learning. And so you need to be taking courses, going to conferences, figuring out like what's going on in the world, and then being able to apply it to your job. When I was strictly an auditor, a lot of that was required for the certifications that I had already had. I have my CPA, my CISA, and my SISM. And so on a yearly basis, you are required to get 40 hours of CPE and report that to keep up with the times. When I moved over to data, there wasn't that requirement. However, I was still taking a lot of courses. I was still going to a lot of conferences, but it was like, hey, where's my CPE certificate? It was like, what are you talking about? So it's still there. There's the data folks in the community, they still continuously learn and they have that urge to do so, but it's just not a required thing.
Yeah, I find that dynamic really interesting. I think it's hard to have continued education in a field that's moving so rapidly like data science. I think in highly regulated spaces, you have a lot of audit, a lot of accounting is dictated by, I guess, the federal government, right? And the federal government doesn't necessarily change as fast as technical infrastructure, the tools that we use, and things along those lines. And so I see value in continued learning, but continued learning that is largely coming from one source of information like the government, or one source of information around a specific set of topics that is can be a refresher, can sometimes be challenging. I think in data it'd be really interesting if there was some hybrid where yes, there's infrastructure, but there's so much freedom in the ways that you could get these credits. I know that for example, my girlfriend is a applied behavioral analyst. Both my parents are doctors. They have to do continued education, but there are some sort of creative, forward-thinking places to educate, but those are almost never as forward-thinking or pushing the boundaries of what's new as the ones that are privatized, or the ones that are essentially elective for people to take. And I find that really interesting. Is that yes? Is it better to just learn to keep up with what other people are doing, or do we have to learn, or is the fun of learning and the cool part about learning is that we're pushing what the boundaries are of ourselves and what the industry is capable of? And obviously I think in data science the stuff that we learn is literally on the cutting edge. Someone might have solved something 2 months ago, and I see a research paper and I learn about that, or there's a course about it, or whatever it might be. I think that's a very beautiful and rare thing. But there's also a lot of data scientists, including myself, that get left behind from a lot of this innovation because there isn't a place where I can just go and have access to a lot of this knowledge that's consolidated. So, I'm interested in your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I kind of see it as like two sides. So you have the learning new things, trying to keep up with what's changing, the shiny new object that could kind of work to your disadvantage, though, because you're moving so quickly that you don't really have the chance to deeply learn all of those new changes. On the other side, I do see maybe some benefit to having like refresher courses for data professionals for those foundational level skills. Just because when I'm working, I've noticed that some people forget about those fundamental skills or techniques, and having refresher courses could help in that respect. So maybe not having it, be that 40-hour requirement, but having it be a lesser requirement to refresh yourself.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about what some of those skills are. For me, a lot of it is related to the assumptions of machine learning models, things along those lines. It's less even about the math or the implementation or coding or any of these types of things. It's, oh, if we're going to use these tools, we should know what they're good for and what their pitfalls are, because that's where we get into trouble is, oh, I use this model, but the assumptions of the model are not relevant for the problem that, or they're problematic for the specific problem that I'm trying to solve. Do you have any thoughts on what might be a good core curriculum for something like that? Because, realistically, I think maybe coding best practices are useful, but those change, especially as we have new systems and things along those lines. Like, what stays static in this domain is something that I'm interested in.
Absolutely. And I think pulling from my background in security is data security and data privacy. I think that's a huge fundamentals that you should revisit and should know how to apply when you're working with data. So those cybersecurity annual trainings that are a requirement that everyone kind of just like clicks through, they're actually super important to understand because they do apply to you, especially when you're performing analytics or building out machine learning models. There are lots of things that you need to do to protect that data before you start using it.
This episode of Kenzera's Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high-performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z8 workstation. I really love that the Z workstations can come standard with Linux or WSL2, and they can be configured with the Data Science Software Stack Manager. With the Software Stack Manager, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
Well, that's actually an interesting question. Sorry to jump around a little bit, but from your auditing experience, from a safety and security perspective, what's something a lot of data people, software engineers, people like us do that might be compromising our security overall or compromising our data or things along those lines? That's something that I'm probably guilty of, like a ton of things, but I'm interested if there's something that I might be able to fix with sort of 80-20. If you stop doing this, this will save you a lot of security compromise in the future.
Yeah, so some basics there is make sure that you have a strong password. Multi-factor authentication is the best way to go. What we used to see a lot, especially with the engineer developer folks, is that the way that their environment was built out, they shared passwords. That is a huge no, because what you're supposed to do is implement these audit logs so that if a data breach does occur, you can kind of backtrace and figure out where it happened and how to close those gaps and whatnot. But if you are sharing an account and sharing those passwords, there's no way that you could remediate that situation if a data breach did occur.
So a lot of it is not just about preventing something from happening. It's a lot. Well, a lot of it is figuring out how to prevent it in the future, and there's systems in place for that, probably for a good purpose. Just like we comment our codes, just like we build infrastructure and use Git and version, there's probably a reason we do that with with other systems as well.
Yeah. If you're storing data on your laptop, you want to make sure that your laptop's encrypted. You also want to make sure that the data that's on your laptop is protected in itself. So you don't want to be carrying around a lot of PII in your data sets. There's some pre-processing techniques that you can go through to protect it in case your laptop is stolen or infiltrated. Or also, when you're performing data analytics or building out those machine learning models, you absolutely do not want to be using that PII to train your models or perform the analysis.
Especially as we start looking into large language models a little bit more and their training, it's probably at a premium. I actually saw something really interesting on, so the like internal prompting for ChatGPT was leaked recently, and there's some interesting stuff about how they are prompting GPT-4 for it to interface as ChatGPT, especially with DALL-E and some of these things. And they don't want you to use any names of artists. They don't want you to use, they don't want ChatGPT when it responds to use names of artists or names of things when you're prompting for images. So if I'm like, hey, paint me a dog wearing a funny hat in the style of Van Gogh, they won't internally use Van Gogh. They'll just use the elements of the time period as well as the style and some of these types of things. And obviously they're probably doing it more for legal reasons than anything else, but it's interesting to think about, are there ways to, even with these large language models, try to anonymize or try to make things more based on style and generalizable things than individual names or characteristics, which I think is a pretty fascinating emerging field within that domain.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the output, it's about the input. So you're already inputting Van Gogh into that model and it's training on that PII already. So it sounds like to me, all they did was shut off that output, don't use that PII, but it's still learning and training its own internal models based on that PII.
Correct. Yeah. Well, it actually specifically said you can use artists that were born before 1912, which is interesting.
Okay.
Maybe there's some weird legal artist union that has something related to that, but who knows? I'm interested. So you obviously branched off into creating the separate data focused audit department within the company. How did your career evolve after that?
Yeah, so after that, I just, I'm a mover and a goer, and I just wanted to move different companies, different departments. Directly after I did that sister department, I stayed within the company, but I think I bounced around to like 2 or 3 different departments within that company because I wanted to understand more how the company worked and what the other departments do. I also kind of got bored or sick of auditing because people don't really like auditors. We're like the bad guys, right? Even though we're trying to help out the company, by the way. But I wanted to move into the business at one point, like be on the good side instead of the dark side, right? And I moved into the business, and I should have known because as an auditor, I knew like not a lot of processes or procedures are documented. And I went into the business and I was like, okay, what am I doing? Like, where's the documentation that I can read to learn what I'm supposed to be doing at my work? And they're like, yeah, about that. We don't have documentation here. And I was like, of course you don't. All right. But it was another learning experience. I learned more about data governance. We were rolling out a data governance program to the entire company. So learning more about that side was pretty cool. There is still an overlap to what I was doing in audit, but it was an interesting experience to kind of dip my toe into the business side of things.
So I'm interested in your experience with transitioning the business stuff, but also analytics stuff. I think that, and I could be wrong about this assumption, but this is sort of how I view it. It seems like auditing is largely, it's like 80% organization and like essentially making sure things are structured and following certain protocols, and probably 20% analytical. I think data is probably maybe like 60% analytical and 40% organizational, where you're creating documentation, you're using Git, there's infrastructure, there's project management tickets, there's all these things that help to support largely the analytical work. And then I found business is probably closer to 90%, not necessarily analytical, but 90% getting stuff done, and 10% of the time really focusing on documentation or tracking things or organizationally responding to things. Maybe a little bit more than that 10%, but it probably varies by company. There's probably someone on a sales team that's 100% just making deals and not documenting everything. How do you navigate that, one as an individual, but two as a business, so that those three groups can work together? Because that's something I think a lot of people see friction between data people and quote unquote business people, or business people and auditors, or even data people and auditors. And they don't realize that it just comes from their different approaches to their work, in the sense that there are these different ratios that they pay attention to different like analytics or like core work versus organizational work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I from my experience, would say that it boils down to the language that you're using. So while you're an auditor, you are speaking with different groups, and basically you need to translate when you're talking to the IT folks and when you're talking to the business folks. They speak very different languages. And so if you can become that translator between those two, then it's easier to become a translator between your work and the business work, or your work and the IT work. And so I think just making sure that everyone's on the same page, and being that continuous learner and continuous teacher. So describing and explaining like why you're doing the things that you're doing, not just coming at them and saying you're doing your job wrong, right? Like explaining like, this is why I believe that you can improve your processes, and give them suggestions on improvements. Usually you tie it to some regulations that they need to adhere to and whatnot. But boils down to, I think, everyone kind of speaking that same language makes it easier to collaborate together.
How do you get people on the same time frame? Because I feel like auditing in particular, and data science as well, there are things that pay off in the longer term, or they even pay off if something doesn't happen, which is kind of hard to quantify, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile that with people that want, for example, a sales team that wants to make sales today, that wants things to get done? I mean, it's like, oh, you don't have a business without sales, and having these sales now helps us have this, quarterly improvement or whatever it is, and my bonus depends on this, whatever it might be. But you also don't have a business in 2 years if everything you're doing is undocumented and leaked and all of these bad things. To me, there's a very difference in time priority between two groups. Is there a way to close that gap? Because that's something that I struggle with pretty much every company I've worked with, is that, oh, we're on different timelines with similar outcomes of maximizing company revenue and good done. But
Yeah. I don't think you can ever officially close that gap. Unfortunately, I have not found a way to successfully do that. But one thing that I did find that helps out a little bit is to create milestones. Rather than you cannot complete the entire project 100%, kind of create those milestones and check in with your stakeholders or the other business departments and whatnot with mini stopping points. Yeah. So instead of from beginning to end, here is your product, kind of build out those like MVPs, right? Set dates for those as well, because they will still want dates, but have them be more manageable. It's kind of the whole line of like Agile, the iterative building, which I've noticed has not kicked up as fiercely in data science yet, or at least not on the teams that I have worked on. I know that's something that's still trying to be built out, kind of like how software engineering works. It's not as clean as those types of teams. Have you ever worked in a data science team that does Agile right?
I've worked on a couple where elements of the data science process did Agile. So the machine learning engineers, the data engineers can operate in Agile pretty effectively because there's very clear inputs and outputs. It's estimating how long something takes to productionize a model or to write a query or whatever it might be is pretty straightforward. But for the exploratory work or new projects or information gathering, like the whole EDA process, it's very hard to estimate that. And so I've seen a lot of pushback from more traditional data scientists. I do think largely, though, the data science role is shrinking and you're getting more specialization into the compartments of that role, like data engineers, analytics engineers, machine learning engineers, and then like data analysts probably won't ever work super well on Agile unless it's just dashboarding. So I think that there there are opportunities to do for it to work better. Will it ever work for pure data scientists who are doing research or exploratory work? Maybe not. And I
Yeah.
think that that's okay. But at least in my mind, the transition of the industry is towards um, like more easy quantification of all of the timelines by breaking them apart.
Yes.
But yeah, I really don't know if there ever will be a way to purely accurately estimate some elements of. I mean, you think of a machine learning researcher, are you going to be like, hey, in 2 weeks, I need this insight, or I need you to develop this new model that no one's ever created before? I don't think a lot of those things can necessarily be be rushed or time boxed or anything along those lines.
Yeah. And plus in the audit world, like the audit timeframes are a lot different than the business timeframes. So
Are they larger loops, shorter loops? What do those look like?
I think it depends. I mean, it depends really. When I was doing my external auditing, I was only on site for a certain amount of time. So I basically needed to get my work done within a week. Um, versus like if you're in internal audit, you have more leeway to be able to work with the business because they're busy doing their work, right? A lot of times that we're waiting on stuff from the business. So yeah, it's one of those big. It depends on the audit timelines.
Interesting. So maybe moving away from audits, timelines, those types of things. More recently, you're working and helping people break into the data domain. I'm wondering, from your experience, what is something that's overlooked in that space? What are people not getting about how to land a job? Because I know that a lot of people out there are struggling in that domain.
Yeah. A lot. I did a lot of interviewing last year and asking the same question to people that are trying to break into data. And a lot of folks were saying their project portfolios, not only understanding what to build out, but how to share that in an interview. So, like they have their project portfolio, it has some projects in it, but they get to the interview and they're like, here you go. And then it's like, no, you need to explain what you did, what business problems you were trying to solve, maybe loop in some techniques that you used, but only if they apply directly to the position that you are trying to interview for. So kind of things like that, but solely around the portfolio where a lot of people were talking about.
Interesting. And so what is like the most actionable advice you've had for that? Is it related to, it's obviously around telling better stories? Is it around doing better projects? Is there, what can someone take away and say, oh my goodness, like this is what I was doing wrong?
I would say to have projects in your portfolio that are directly related to an industry that you're trying to apply for. That way you get that bonus experience points from the hiring managers. You have seen kind of the data that you would be working with and having that experience behind it. Also, another advice that I like to share is to try to use your own data if you can to build out a project, because that way you kind of understand that data already and you have a lot of interesting questions that you probably want to understand from that data. So then you get that curiosity and problem solving mode really solidified, and then that translates into the interview as you being more excited about sharing that project. Because if you've ever like taken a course and you're sharing your project at the end of the course or whatever, and you're just like, okay, this is what I did because I had to do it and here it is, versus like, hey, I just downloaded my Fitbit information. And guess what? In the summertime, I'm actually not as active as I thought I was.
It's interesting that you bring up the individual data. To me, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So when it comes to, let's say it's starting a podcast, starting a business, landing a job, you're always better off if you're in a situation where you can showcase something that you can uniquely do. So, let's take this podcast for example. So maybe there's other people who can have who can do data podcasts, totally fine. But I'm in a situation where I have access to a lot of interesting people through LinkedIn, through a lot of these other networks. I've been able to put on events where I get to meet a lot of these people, and I fortunately have some background of talking to people, being on camera, so I'm comfortable there, but also domain knowledge of an industry and those types of things. And so if you put all those things together, there's very few other people that can, really host a podcast in the domain and in the way that I do, because I've developed a lot of these prerequisite things. The same thing is with using your own data. How many other people have that exact same data? Literally no one. And so you can tell unique stories about that probably no one else has unique insight into, just as you described. I remember I released all of my YouTube data, maybe it was a year, 2 years ago on Kaggle. And there's this big spike that for a lot of people was unexplainable. And to me, it made a lot of sense because I think I was like a YouTube creator on the rise for a day and I was on the trending page. And so to me, it's like, oh, that's what happened. That's an outlier. That's not a normal occurrence. But for everyone else, it was very confusing what that anomaly would be. But in my mind, if you're going into an employer, what they care most about is that unique insight, because you're on the inside of those companies. Once you get hired, you know all of the inside information that's happening. You can start to make those insights and to be able to make the adjustments based on the knowledge that you have of the material and of the company. And that's where a lot of the important insight comes out of. Is not necessarily, a lot of people are going to be trying the same methods and models and whatever it might be. It's largely about how you're viewing it through the lens of the company that creates value that's going to be different. And in my mind, that's a way you can show that unique value or that problem solving ability that is different than what other people are doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So with that Fitbit example that I shared, and in general, I would advise like maybe using other data sets to see why you have these anomalies. So you might have thought usually you are very active in the summer, but this particular year you were not. Bring in some weather data, you had just rain the entire summer, right? So you didn't get outside, you didn't want to go to the gym, you just stayed inside the whole time. And so you can incorporate those findings when you're sharing as well. So inside knowledge, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I see on Reddit, there's a thread called Data's Beautiful.
Yes.
And I've been seeing a lot of these recently where people have their calendar of their like drinking days, like how much alcohol they consume. And some people do a dry January or something along those lines. And that's an interesting one too, is, oh, I'm tracking all these other metrics. How does something like that fit into these things? You might not want to share that one in an interview, just if you're drinking a lot.
Right. But don't show them your spike in the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. That could be an interesting one. But it's part of, I will hire, in my opinion, I would hire someone who indexes more on creativity than someone who just indexes on rote technical skills. I'm a huge believer that technical skills can be taught. How many hundreds of thousands, millions of people learn Python every year? A lot, to a probably proficient level. That's not what differentiates one candidate from another candidate. At least from what I've seen.
It is. I've been interviewing a lot of hiring managers for my program lately to understand like what are you actually looking for entry level candidates, and it's not the technical skills, because it's like, okay, you both have Python, but it's those transferable skills that I often talk about a lot. How do you problem solve? Are you curious? Do you have that creativity, like you just mentioned? Like, it's those things on top of enthusiasm in your storytelling throughout that interview that puts you above another candidate.
Yeah. I mean, there's also just like interesting stuff too, is that, this is the human side of interviewing. And I haven't really interviewed anyone in probably 3 years since I was doing a lot of interviewing then. More recently, I've enjoyed not having to interview quite as many people. Might make me a little more distance from the problem. But a lot of the time, you just interview people because you're like, this is an interesting person. I would like to have a conversation with them and understand what they're about. I mean, you have someone that's like, oh, they played professional racquetball or something. You're like, oh, what would drive someone to play sort of a non-mainstream sport at a really high level? Mm-hmm. If they're willing to dedicate that time into a sport that probably doesn't have that much return, like, how much effort would they put into a company or their work if they really enjoyed it? Or, oh, this person played in an orchestra, or like founded some organization that is focused on, I don't know, like searching for aliens or something like that. It's inherently like interesting people attract interesting opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I think so many people try to be like other candidates that they really hurt themselves, because if you try to be like everyone else, you're not going to be the best at being like everyone else. Right. Yes. And if you are differentiated, someone's going to notice you. At least it could be bad, but I'd rather be a black, well, unless I was being led to the slaughter, I'd rather be a black sheep that sticks out, because at least you're paid attention to. You might get worse treatment, you might get better treatment, but overall you will get some observance of yourself if you, again, do some things fundamentally differently.
Absolutely, you'll definitely stick out.
So I'm interested. You've mentioned talking to quite a few people over the last year. I've obviously heard your podcast. I'm excited to be able to talk to a fellow podcaster. Can you tell me just about that overall experience, what you've learned, and maybe how it all came together?
Yes. So I have to thank you for me starting the podcast. You mentioned, yes, everyone has a podcast, but everyone should have a podcast for the mere skills building of your public speaking. And so when I heard you say that, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it then. And so last year in January, I started my podcast interviewing a bunch of data nerds. We have a casual conversation about who they are. I ask them about their origin stories because we're nerds and I like comic books. And then we get into fun bits and we talk about hobbies, specifically like what skills that they learn in their hobbies and how it translates into making them a better data professional. And hopefully that highlights basically those skills that data professionals use on a daily basis, those transferable skills and whatnot. And I've talked to so many people, learned so many different things, and we just kicked off season 2 this year. And I'm just excited to continue doing it. And thank you again for allowing me, giving me the inspiration.
Yeah. Well, congrats on a full year. What do you think was the biggest thing that you learned? Maybe one, about yourself over the course of the year, and two, about the broader people that you've interviewed.
Oh, lessons learned. I can definitely see me being more comfortable from like video 1 to video 50. So that's a cool transition, and just, getting out of my comfort zone, getting more comfortable with talking with people, and asking better questions is something that I've been trying to work on, and I can see it getting better throughout the year as well. Another thing that I also learned is that hosting a podcast and being on somebody else's podcast is something completely different. And so this year, I'm like, I need to practice being on other people's podcasts. So thank you again, Ken, for allowing me to be on this podcast.
Of course, happy to help.
I oddly like talking about yourself is a lot different than talking with other people, because I like to highlight other people and their awesomeness and just learning more from them. And then it's like, oh, well, what about you? Some people ask me questions during the podcast, but I'm like, I don't know how to answer that. Like, put me on the spot. So yeah, just getting out there more and sharing my story.
Amazing. And so what was your maybe one of the most meaningful things you've taken away from what you've learned from your guests?
I think I would have to say that everyone has a squirrely path into data. Or I actually thought about like making a compilation of it was pretty much every origin story started off with some form of, oh, I had a unique journey into data. And that makes me feel better about myself and also about the folks that I'm mentoring, because I'm like, there is no clear path. You can still make it into data no matter where you're coming from. Like, let's do this.
Yeah, I think like the only path is your path, right? There's no one tried and true approach to break into the field. There's people that have done PhDs in psychology, there's consultants, there's teachers, there's journalists, there's all sorts of people who have gotten into the domain from very, very different places,
Absolutely.
including myself and yourself. I mean, fundamentally different approaches, different levels of education, anywhere from PhDs to people who don't even have a college degree. So I find it very fascinating that everything you read online is, oh, what is the number one path? What is the approach? But there's probably some higher percentage ones, which is fine. But there's also downsides to different approaches. You know, it's been interesting. More recently, I've been reevaluating the master's in data science or master's in computer science. I used to be very anti those degrees. Granted, I do have a master's in computer science, so I can't be too anti it. But based on the time frame, it made a lot of sense. In the new market, I wouldn't say I've completely gone against what I was saying before, but I reserve the right to change to say, okay, this could be a good way in. You know, this buys you time, this buys you this, but there's absolutely a cost, especially if you're in the US. You know, if you're in the US, there's a good financial cost that if you don't really apply yourself, you might not have the opportunities. Like a master's in computer science might be worth it with doing all the other hard work and doing these things to put yourself in the right place. But a master's in computer science in and of itself will not do anything for you if you don't change how you interview, you change your approach to getting jobs, you change your resume, you look at your portfolio, or you get internship experience along the way. And then you look at the same thing in Germany or another country where a master's degree is virtually free. And it's like, well, why aren't more people taking advantage of that? You should do that if you have the opportunity to learn and do that, and potentially buy yourself some time to get some new roles, internships, whatever it might be. So I think it's interesting how complex those things are, and that one size fits all advice really doesn't work super well, unless that advice is to follow your own path and what makes sense for your specific situation. Really be introspective and think about it and do your due diligence.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, so how can people learn more about the podcast? How can people give it a listen, tune in?
Yeah, so I am on YouTube. I'm also on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, all the streaming platforms. I stream on Thursdays at 9 a.m. Arizona time.
Okay. Well, hopefully when we're at the meetup, we'll be able to get in and do one of us. That would be a lot of fun.
Yes, that would be great.
Perfect. Just inviting myself on other people's shows. I love it. No, I'm just kidding.
You are very welcome on the show.
Monica, those are all the questions I had. Any final thoughts? Any additional ways people can reach out or learn more?
Yeah, I pretty much live on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do that. Also, if you are looking to transition from another field into the data field, if you want to break into data without breaking anything, again, message me on LinkedIn. I have my new mentor program, which I'm very excited about, and help out all of you that want to be data nerds.
Amazing. Thank you so much again for coming on. It was great speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken.